Well, hi, this is Justin. I want to welcome you back to the Psychic Roots of Poetry. This, I think, is our 17th. Let me just arrange some things here if I could. I seem to be a little bit... What's going on here? Let me try one thing here. That looks a little better. For some reason, it's always a surprise as to what the lighting will wind up being. And for some reason, I forgot to get things started here. Let me, if I could. Get some things going in terms of our background videos, because the one I like to show you, and of course in the real world we'd have technicians to take care of this, but unfortunately the real world never seems to set itself up correctly, so we're always moving around between the real world and the world as we see it. And here we go right here. I just want to set up some options here if I could, so we can get on with our business here. Okay, I wanted to get a little thing kind of going there in the background for you, because that is the myth that came to me around 2000 or so. One of those things that I could never explain, and I eventually made an audio video version of it because it was long. And people don't like long poems today. In fact, they don't like poems today, but they do like movies. So what happened is I was able to have a friend who happened to drop over some fractals to me many years ago, and I didn't know what to do with them until this poem came to me, and I suddenly realized a couple of years after it had come to me that it was a perfect match for the oral versions, one of those gifts that the gods send, you know. So I'll let it play in back of me. It's just that I think it's your visual version kind of speaks for itself. It's like a Bach fugue. There's music, there's the spoken myth itself, which is multi-voiced, and there's also the visual layer. And each of the layers will get to you in their appropriate time. However, today, you know, in the last session, what I had just spoken to you about was the difference between the pre-literate consciousness and our current, what I call explaining logical consciousness. And I gave three situations where the pre-literate people had constructed what we would call today performance art. That is, they acted out a scenario in praise of the mother goddess. And that their entire consciousness was not concerned with explaining things. They just took the world as a given. It was around them. Don't forget, they lived in very natural surroundings. And there was nothing strange about them. They would have strange occurrences from time to time, volcanoes, storms, etc., you know, pestilence. But the world consisted of the beauty and the dangers of the animal and the vegetable world. It was around them, and they went through cycles. Some were very subtle in the tropical areas. Some in the northern hemispheres were extremely different between spring, fall, and winter and summer, you know. But their major activity was to praise the gods and to praise creation. And they did this by imitating, which is what artists do. They made little worlds. They were storytellers. They understood they were storytellers. And so what they did is they made worlds, stories, where they were able to imitate the larger creation. It's a very small story that we make, no matter who we are, whether a Homer or a Shakespeare. But it's a little world that is created, and it was offered to the gods as a praise, saying that we understand and praise this world of creation and destruction. They didn't try to move the devil out to one corner. You know, that creation and destruction were intermixed. They were part of the same unity. You can't separate them. That's been the real bane of our existence in the Christian world, is trying to separate the destructive part of creation. You can't create without destruction going on. It just happens. The poet understands it. The soul understands it, but the logical mind, it wants God to be all good, our Western God, and then how does this evil or this devil or this destruction or this pain get in there, and there's all kinds of mechanisms it goes through to explain it in philosophy, but the better solution is that it's one and the same. And that the life force, whatever you want to call it, the dream behind the various gods, the source of the dream behind the various gods, which is completely unknowable, is both creative and it's destructive. That's just the way it is, So, pre-literate man understood this, didn't try to explain his way out of it, just accepted it. So all of his praising was with that state of mind. Didn't try to explain away the bad from the good. Would hold it up, and I explained in terms of human sacrifices, things like that, in terms of sexual copulations with animals and with women that were staged, were essentially praises of the first major goddess that had erupted from the unconscious into the conscious mind, and that was the mother goddess. There are other gods as well, the animal gods, the snakes and the foxes and the bears and the tigers and the ravens and all the rest of it, So the important thing to understand is the mind was always imitative. And I think we can understand from our point of view, since I'm not really concerned with anthropology, what I'm concerned with is poetry. It's the perfect venue for poetry. If you take pre-literate man, that he had other arts as well as he advanced beyond the early stages. We know that from some of the cave drawings that are 30 or 40,000 years old, at least what we think we can date them at. Those that were carved into stone or were drawn on caves showed that he had that he had other outlets too in his art. But the primary form of art that was overwhelming was poetry. It's not the written little poetry we have today in magazines and things like that. It was a acted out from the unconscious, not from a script. It was an acted out, spoken, sung poetry in which the early peoples went into or surrendered to their unconscious, which was very easy for them, because I believe in the very early stages that the conscious mind, that part of our mind which somehow evolved with the ability to tell stories, which is something that we couldn't do before, was very fragile, and that the pre-literate man in the early stages was drifting between what we would call a dream world and what we would call a conscious world. In fact, I would say that probably his waking world, which is what you're looking at me now, hopefully, in your waking world, was very similar to his dream world. Just slightly different. He had a little bit more control, and he was able to fabricate stories that held together in time and space, How do we get from those first early stages? And in fact, I believe that those first early stages of poetry, let's talk about poetry, that I explained in a couple of earlier sessions, that at some stage of the game, some gesture or some sound had to be developed or came from the unconscious, or something that was a connector in time, and, but, then, yeah, now, whatever it happened to be. And I brought back some Melanesian pidgin to kind of show you that the various words, and is na, yet is na, now is na, that's a much later version of a language, but in fact it illustrates the really important thing is that the connector was important in order to allow the story to progress in time. In fact, that connector may have developed, and here I'm just letting myself go in terms of my thinking, you know, is that I think that it developed before I or you, because those could be signal, me, you know, that kind of thing. That it was a connector that allowed the states of being that were fetched up from memory. I saw you by the river. I loved you more than ever. And there's a connector there that allows those states of being to be connected. That establishes a rhythm in human speech, which is different than the repetitive melodies we get from insects and birds and wolves or whatever, which are repeated sounds. This is an inflection, basically. It's a rhythm that's set up on top of the words themselves or the gestures themselves or whatever it happens to be. And we're talking here basically about a language that was composed of animal sounds, and it was composed of gestures that the very first humans would have known because they were animals, and those would have been retained. But something else had to develop to have those go through. And I think that connector word, or some combination of gesture and that word, since the same word was used for many things, like something like that would be like and, you know, continue, but it might be like that, nah, you know. That's how it's done in Pidgin, by the way. There's very few words, and so it's the gestures that you have really determine as to what the word nah means, okay? But what I think happened in the very first stages is that early man, very early man, we're talking about the hunter-gatherer stage right after becoming human, let's say, I don't know, within, God knows, you know, for the first 10,000 years or so, you know, through a whole series of generations, that in fact he may not have had a whole lot of language, but in fact relied on just a few words, mime and sounds that he had inherited from his animal self to communicate in stories. But he did have a connected word very early, I think, in order to because if you want a desire to tell a story, which is a complex emotion in which a parade of characters and situations what do I say? They carry an emotion. So if you listen to it, suddenly these little soldiers pass a very complex feeling on to the person who is the listener. What I think happened eventually is that in fact I think from the very beginning that in fact the gods appeared, and in fact it may not have been your mother goddess first, or it may have been, it's hard to say, but for sure the animals would have appeared and would have broken through that thin consciousness in terms of a vision. That's what, in fact, eventually became the voices that Jane speaks about. But these were visions in which there were sounds and there were gestures done by the animals, or in fact done by the mother goddess eventually, that broke through consciousness and communicated guidance, just like the voices did at some later stage of our pre-literate development. At some stage, of course, those became words. We, in fact, developed language because the stronger the desire is to communicate feelings, a complex set of feelings, then in fact, it's pretty obvious that at some stage we have to develop language. Let's just say that happened at some stage. It's a mystery that is deep, but as we know when we look at the Aborigine, the pigeons that they develop, whether they're in Asia or whether they're in South America or whether they're in New Guinea or wherever they are, they already have the elements of grammar: subject, noun, object, subject, verb, object. And they're very small vocabularies, by the way, you know, so they fill in the rest with gesture and with the inflection of what they're saying, you know. We don't really know that today. What we do is we write so completely and so easily and so fluently that we've developed about a 400,000 word vocabulary, which allows us to communicate extremely complex feelings, tragedies, by the words themselves. That's the miracle of written poetry, and it's the miracle of your writing when it's fully extended, that the words on the page do everything. what had been done before by mask and costume and by speaking and singing and music and movement, whatever had been done by that in the oral poetry that developed over the millennium until we approached about the age of writing, is eventually, over a couple of 1,000-year period from the invention of writing, that we developed very complex vocabularies that allowed us to express very complex emotions by words alone. And in fact, that's what we have today. So, in fact, it's any wonder when we get poets up to read their poetry, since they're so used to seeing the words on the page that they develop say everything, that their inflection is monotone. Don't need to have any emotion. The words have them, but unfortunately, the ear is not like the eye. The eye grabs the emotion from the words in the act of reading, but the ear wants to hear the emotion, and that's why you get so many poetry readings are so boring. It's horrible. But in fact, that's an aside as to the difference between written poetry and between oral poetry, true oral poetry. That the oral poetry, you hear the emotion. It's there. You know, it's just like when you're talking to somebody. It's composed of ordinary speech, but it's charged from a different source, from the unconscious, from the muse, rather than from or just your conscious memories. Okay, so it's alive. I like to say that in terms of the written poem is much like the dried, kind of desiccated, beautiful butterflies you see pinned to a board, and the oral poetry is the butterfly in flight. Just comes from your mouth and goes, and it's gone on the wind. It only resides in the hearts of the listeners for that period of time. How did those first eruptions, let's just take in terms of the mother goddess, for example, in terms of her erupting with some series of sounds and gestures and a vision that struck the first humans as a form of guidance, you know, whatever, anger or something, some very short story which they would interpret then, and they would speak amongst themselves that the mother goddess has told us to do this or that, and they would, because when you get a vision, it's not an hallucination. People have never had any kind of vision, don't understand that. I've had both. I did a lot of drugs when I was younger, like everybody else in the 60s, and I can tell you that the difference between a vision and between any kind of insight you get on any drug, that's of the LSD type drugs, is completely different. The vision is sane. It comes to you, speaks to you, and it rivets you with a truth that is undeniable. You don't have any question whether it's an hallucination. You know it's not of this world that has seized control of your mind for an instant or a second or for moments or for hours, but it has a reality of truth to it that is undeniable, and which it's very difficult to turn away from. You can do it, like you can turn away from a friend who tells you a truth that is undeniable. But at some stage you're going to whip back to it, and you know that you have to listen to what was being said to you at risk, because you are at risk. That's an internal guidance from a unknown source that just feels so true that to avoid it or to not listen to it and act on it is stupid. It's just stupidity. You have to act on it. Well, what happens is that I think that over time, that in fact the unconscious, and we'll take in the sense in terms of how the words are formed eventually as we get a few words into our skulls, okay, which I'll have to go into later as to how I think that happened, and who knows, it's really a mystery that we could somehow, in fact, all agree on a language, because if you carry it out to its logical conclusion, you would assume, since we're all individual human beings, we would be in a babble of tongues. What's coming to us, the word for tree comes to me, and the word for tree comes to somebody else, a completely different. How do we agree or how do we disagree? You know, is it a matter of just sorting it out over time, or did the words come up remarkably similar? I tend to lean a little bit more towards the latter explanation as to how we could ever develop language, you know, in terms of a small group of people. I'm not talking about people separated by thousands of miles. We know their languages develop differently. But let's say we're at a stage where in fact that the goddess is coming to us, and she's coming to us in rhythmic language, because I believe what happened is that some version of the mother goddess spun off. Don't forget that the unconscious mind is always hearing the emotions in the story presented by the first humans. And the first humans are praising creation and the mother goddess. That they hear, but they're hearing the gods, if you will, or in fact the unconscious, the same unconscious that we have. It's hearing the emotions and the rhythm. And the emotions are one of love and praise. Might be fear there too. You know, fear and love are not separate. Even today, ask anybody who's deeply loved. There's always the fear that you're not loved back. You know, you're blind to it, you know, and people who have a habit of falling in love, which is generally women, there's always that fear in the back of their minds that, in fact, they're not loved as deeply as they are loving. They're blind to it. They can't tell. There's always that uncertainty in them, you know, but they can't stop loving, you know. So that love is present, but there's a little tinge of fear in there that they'll be blindsided to some degree. But anyway, all those emotions are there, and they are giving in the praise of the gods. And how the gods respond, we have to remember that this is a two-way process. This is not something I invented. You can read Jung if you really want to understand the unconscious. I wouldn't read Freud. That's just a special kind of, I don't know what that is. It's a kind of theory that supposedly works, but as far as we know, when we look back at the cases that were supposedly cracked and people moved out of the neurosis, we don't really see that really clearly anymore, whereas I think Jung really kind of gave us understanding that there's a commerce going on between the conscious mind and the unconscious mind. The unconscious mind is in a constant state of making its contents conscious. We can ignore it or not. It does it all the time in dreams. We can ignore it. It's like we're living with a brother who doesn't care whether we pay any attention to it. But if we do pay attention to it, those contents of the unconscious will enrich our conscious life and make us more whole. And that's what he saw as the whole act of life, is to make the unconscious conscious. That's an ocean that seems so inexhaustible to me as to how much could ever become conscious, we don't know. But we know there's a two-way commerce in it, and if you can read Jung about the progression of the Hebrew God from an angry, unpredictable God to the final loving, almost human God, you can see that the unconscious, which is another way of equating with God, it was easy for Jung to do that, and I can do it too, and the soul equally, you know. If we take away the special meanings of each that we've accreted over the years, that basically the unknowable, whether it's within us or without us, not important at this stage. We can't control it. That we see that at least in terms of the Western God, changed. And it changed because of the actions of the humans consciously in terms of speaking to God. It sets up a dialogue. So that both the conscious person changes and the unconscious person changes. And what happens eventually, I think, is that there's a special facet of the mother goddess spun off with a different voice and a guiding voice. I can just say that I detect in the voice of the muse and my infrequent guiding voices that will come to me, they're completely different. The voice of the muse, when I hear it, is sharing, it's loving, it's like, it's a storytelling voice, it's an invitation into a whole new world that the unconscious has picked up from us. Whereas the guiding voice retains its old, this is the way to do this. They're usually very even voices. And they have picked up a little bit of the rhythm of the human speaking, because the unconscious wants to communicate. So it would always have that human rhythm that it picked up. But the guiding tone, the one that comes in terms of the goddess guiding voice, don't do this, whatever it happened to be. This is what you should do. Much different from the more human voice of the muse. And the muse has been with us ever since. It has never disappeared. Even in these so-called atheistic times, whatever you want to call them, or these scientific times, for poets at least, and for artists who work from a highly intuitive level, and they'll tell you they will call the muse the same thing. The muse is that that comes out as a gift, and it's almost completely formed. You just have to surrender to what it's guiding you towards. And the poem or the statue, like in the case of Michelangelo, will yield itself out of the material of life, which in his case was your marble. So we know those voices started to come like that, and in fact, it maybe has come. You know, when I had the myth come to me called the Witness's Log myth, one of the things that was apparent to me in the poem was that all of the actors, and this includes the listeners and the visitors and everything, were always plural. There is no I, there's only we. And in the first representation of the muse, it's always the muses or the gods, even in the Bible. You know, the Hebrews had an honesty that refused to let them change it just to a singular God, even though God developed that way. They kept it in the very early books as the gods. But also in the Greeks, it's the muses, and then eventually became the muses. Everything else changed to one, and that came with our rational explaining minds. So they may have heard voices. Now, why did the first form of poetry come out as antiphonal, as a kind of group poetry? I think it happened because how these things happen is, one is they're a tribe. They're much different than the way we operate. We have our little houses. We don't talk to one another. But they're living in close, cohesive things. They're hearing and seeing the same vision. They're in an active communication with each other. You know, they're living around a campfire, you know, in little huts or caves, whatever it is. But also that they have a little bit of that herd mentality. You know, they move together. Animals who move together instinctively, and I think they still had some of that. So it was partly that everything they did together. That's one explanation as to why. And if you think of how these praises of the gods would come, somebody would have feel a poem coming to them, you know, when the muse would speak. Now it's a kind of new voice inviting them in, and that would produce those words and that energy and that direction. It comes in many ways, in pictures, and sometimes it comes directly off your tongue. You don't even know what you're saying, but you have to say it. Is that they would start to praise the gods, and the other tribe members would simply join in. They knew it was an important event. Nobody had to stage it. Oh, at 4:45 we're going to have a praise of the gods and rain. It hadn't rained for weeks and weeks, and everybody was getting pretty thirsty. One of the people would get the inspiration to start to praise the gods and to question as to why there was no rain, as to what can we do. We love the rain when it comes. It makes us happy. Whatever they're going to say, we're dying without it. Hear us, you know. So what would happen is that, in fact, the others would join in probably as just a copy, you know. Oh gods, the tribe goes. We are thirsty, and so on. And you have that first antiphonal poetry. It probably started that way, and it's the way that it would keep going for thousands and thousands of years, I think, because that first kind of visit by the muse in terms of a poem to the gods, a praise to the gods, would come to one. They would start to move and do it out, and in fact the others would join it over time. There's also the situation which we have to understand is that these were imitative creatures, and they wanted to imitate everything that in fact in terms of how the gods operated. So if a poem happened, a praise happened, let's call it a praise first, okay? Because the first Greek word for poem, by the way, is poiein, which means to make. It's nothing about words, nothing about lines or similes or metaphors, or just to make. It's to construct a little world, you know? So in fact, we should remember that first impulse was simply to receive something from the gods, some kind of inspiration, and then to speak to the gods. The gods speak, and we speak back. And I think between the tribal nature of the peoples and a desire to imitate the gods speak and we speak back, that the antiphonal form gelled. And it became the form for poetry. In fact, it became so important in the spiritual praising of the gods that it lasted right up today into the Catholic Church. You see it, for sure. And you can see it in the literate Greek theater, where a man would speak and the chorus would be in back, and they would be responding and adding to what he said. So the gods speak, and we add to that speaking is really a way to think of it. Because like Jane Washington said to me in Alice Hickey, she said, saying that your God was like your Gladys Knight, that in fact, no matter what Gladys Knight says, the Pips always riff on Gladys. They don't repeat exactly what she says. So it's the muse speaks and we riff on the muse speaking. Okay? So what happens is that the form itself is an imitation of how poetry is made, how that making occurs. The gods speak, inspire, we respond. That and the collective nature of the tribe. And it was so powerful and so enduring that it went right out of the age of pre-literate humans and has lasted right up until the current time. It's always considered to be a highly spiritual form in any religious celebration. People often don't know why. Why are we doing this? But it was retained intuitively. Some far distant memory and custom says this is a highly spiritual form, and it's an imitation of how God speaks to us and how we add to what God is saying. Sometimes it's just an imitation, it's a copy, and sometimes it riffs on it, like Gladys Knight and the Pips. The Pips riff on Gladys. They don't really say exactly what she says. They kind of twist it and move it. They make it more human, more rhythmic. And that eventually, as we went into our single-mindedness, sometimes around the invention of writing, and who's to say what caused what? It's like the chicken and the egg. You really can't say. That's what Jane says too, is that we started to develop, when we see at Homer, we have a single-voiced poetry. He's still hearing the gods, but he's speaking to the gods in a singular voice. Always in public, always to people. It's a public thing. I speak to gods and to men. It has the same character, but we have dropped off the early antiphonal form, which is very difficult to do when you're talking about long epic poems. I suspect if we were able to go back in time to Homer's time, that many of the lyrical poems, and I can assure you they were, whales don't exist in an ocean only. There are lots of other little fish too. They would also have existed, and I suspect that even as we approached the age of literacy, that many of them would still be antiphonal, done by small groups. We see it in Africa today. Okay, that's a much later stage of development. So that's something really to think about, just how powerful the urge in human beings is to imitate. It's powerful, and I think it's the driving force that led poetry to be a group antiphonal poetry long before it then developed into a single voice poetry as we approached a different consciousness. Okay, so with that all said, I'm going to sign off today. I'm going to give you a little bit of antiphonal here. Let me see what we got here. Let's see. I'll find another little. I don't know if you should have one. Here's one. It's about a dark love affair, but you'll hear the antiphonal portion of it, okay?
Maybe it was her hands
walking.
Maybe
I am
it was her hands
running.
Maybe
I am
maybe it was
waking up.
something else.
I am
don't know what
looking at you
it was. I
for the very first time.
don't know what
I am
it was. I don't
looking at you
know any
like I never looked at you
more.
before. I never looked at you. I look at you and I see the one I love,
It wasn't really
the one I hate,
a voice.
the one that went before, the one that comes after.
It was
It was
a dark
the one you feared the most.
angel.
It was. It was
It was a dark angel.
the God you worshipped all your life.
That's what I call it.
Tigers.
It was
There are tigers.
like a voice,
There are tigers coming for you.
but
There are tigers that will eat you alive.
it wasn't
There are men
anything you could hear.
who would rape you. There are men who will call you slave. There are men who will put you in a cage.
It was as if something were calling me.
There are men
That was irresistible
who walk,
and beautiful
who walk.
and true.
There are men who are walking into the light.
But it was calling me
There are men.
to my death.
There are men who are dying.
It was a kind of
There are.
falling
There
into something dark
There are no words.
that was
There are no words.
irresistible
I don't know what to say.
and beautiful
What to say.
and true.
I've been this way before. I am.
And if I didn't
I am the hawk
follow it,
that flies above you and beside you.
and if I didn't follow it, and if I didn't follow it, I would be lost. I would be lost in a different way.